Hello and welcome to another creative coding video. Today we're going to be learning about the very famous Mandelbrot set, a Mandelbrot fractal. It's one of the most famous objects in sort of mathematical art, in mathematics, and it's if you kind of grew up in the 80s, you'll have seen it kind of quite a lot in music, videos, posters, t-shirts and so on. It's an interesting object because it has lots and lots of detail. The detail itself is very sort of organic and natural looking. Actually, mathematically, it has an infinite amount of detail. And the surprising thing is, the mathematics that creates it is really, really simple. And that's what's magic about it. You would look at something that has lots and lots of detail like this and think the mathematics behind that must be really involved and heavy, but surprisingly it isn't. So we'll kind of look at that today. The Mandelbrot fractal itself is this object, and that's kind of an overall view of it. It looks like a beetle of some kind with little kind of things coming off it, little blobs, and they themselves seem to have little blobs, and that's what the word fractal means. The detail, the patterns are self-similar at different scales, and we see this a lot in nature. Mountains, clouds, river systems, plants are fractal. When we zoom in and take a closer look, you can see that there's more detail there. Each of those kind of blobs, the little beetle shapes, seems to have lots of other ones attached to them, and coming off them is a really kind of natural looking patterns and curves and lines. I mean, this looks like sort of flame and fire and lightning, and yet these swirls look like they could be some kind of water creature. Perhaps if we look at another part of the Mandelbrot set, you've got things that look almost space-like, like there might be something to be found on an alien world. And the swirls, again, they look like they've been designed by a human. They're not what you would expect of a very boring, regular, predictable mathematical shape. They're not squares or grids or even circles. These are very, very pleasing to the human eye arrangement of curls and swirls. If we zoom in further, people will find smaller versions of the big thing, so there's lots of this kind of self-similarity, and all of them are slightly different, and that keeps it interesting. And it's fascinating if you're kind of if this kind of thing tickles you, that the level of detail, if we keep zooming in, is infinite. It doesn't stop, and that's an amazing thing in itself. There are different ways of colouring this object. This person's chosen this kind of blue, orange, gold kind of colouring scheme. Somebody else here has chosen a different approach with something that's much smoother and looks like a snowscape. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to do two things. We're going to explore and understand the mathematics behind how this mathematical shape, this Mandelbrot fractal, is created, and I'm going to show you that the mathematics isn't difficult. If you can add and multiply, that's really all you need. There's nothing much more difficult than adding and multiplying involved at all. I know that a lot of the textbooks and online guides sometimes are very deeply mathematical with all kinds of jargon and symbols, and that's a shame because the actual idea is really simple. And we're also today going to write some very simple code to draw this Mandelbrot fractal. It won't be overly sophisticated. We won't have very sophisticated schemes for colouring and so on, or zooming in even. We won't do that because that'll be a bit of a distraction. So today's about writing the very minimum code so that we can understand that the concept is simple, and of course you can take that in any direction you want. So let's dive in. Great. So This mathematical expression you're seeing on the screen, x squared plus c, is simple. It's something you would see, in a sort of children's school. X squared is x times x plus c. That is really simple. I mean, there's only 2 or 3 symbols there. And believe it or not, this is the mathematical formula that sits behind that Mandelbrot set. That's right, this simple formula is responsible for creating all that detail and organic looking kind of swirls and curls and shapes. And that's really surprising, and for many people, including myself, that is really the heart of why the Mandelbrot set is magic. Yes, it's detailed, yes, it's got organic designs and patterns, but the fact that it comes from something so simple, that surprise is what's magic. So we'll kind of see how that works. So the first concept we need to kind of understand, and it's an easy concept, is the idea of taking that kind of expression, that formula, x squared plus c, and the idea of taking what it produces and putting it back into itself. So if we think of this as a machine, this x squared plus c as a machine, and we put something into the machine and something comes out. So if the machine is x squared plus c, if we put 2 into it, 2 squared, so 2 squared is 4 plus c, let's just say 3 is 5. So c is 5. So that becomes 2 squared plus 5 is 9. And then we put 9 back in. So it becomes 9 squared plus 5. C is a constant and doesn't change. So 9 squared is 81 plus 5 is 86. And we can keep doing that. Now there's different names for that. I mean, we can call it iteration. Other people might call it feedback or other fancy terms. The important thing is the idea, and that's a really simple idea. This machine we're looking at is got the function multiply by 2 inside it. Again, very simple. And if we feed this machine the number 2, it gives us 4. So 2 multiplied by 2 gives us 4. That's easy. But if we put 4 back in, we get 8. And if we put 8 back in, we get 16. So you can see how this works. And if we did it for a while, the numbers that were coming out of the machine would get bigger and bigger. So we start with 2 over here, over there, and the machine produces 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on, and the numbers get bigger and bigger. If the machine didn't say multiply by 2, but divide by 2, then the numbers get smaller. So we start with 2, the machine pops out 1, half, quarter, eighth, and so on. So if we change what's in the machine, we get different results. So multiplied by 2 gets bigger, divided by 2 gets smaller. That makes sense. That's nothing complicated about that. This time, let's have a machine that says x squared. And that's deliberately chosen because it's very similar to that x squared plus c. And this time, if we feed 2 into the machine, we get 4, 16, 256. And the numbers get bigger very quickly. It's an exponential growth. The numbers really are getting large very rapidly. Now, if we change the starting number, we'd get a different pattern. So if we said half is a starting value, half squared is a quarter, and then a quarter squared is a 16th, and so on and so on. So the numbers get smaller. So the machine is the same, but the starting number decides whether the sequence gets bigger or smaller. that's just saying that 2, we end up with a sequence that grows, half a sequence that gets smaller and smaller. So there's something about the starting number that's important. And it's natural then to think, okay, why don't we make a map that shows how numbers behave, whether there are regions of numbers which get bigger and which regions the numbers get smaller. It's almost like colouring in a map and showing the different kinds of behaviour, as it were. So on the screen we've got a number line going from -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and in between you can see half, 1 1/2 and so on. Now we want to show which regions of the number line behave in different ways, which regions lead to a sequence that gets bigger and bigger, and which regions lead to a sequence that gets smaller and smaller. So we know that 2 gets bigger and bigger. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16, 16 becomes 256, and so on. And we've coloured that green. We also know that half gets smaller, so we've coloured that red. And we can do this for other numbers as well. We can pick 1.5 or -2 and see what happens to the number sequence. And -2 gets bigger because -2 squared is 4, and then we're back on the same sequence as the other one. 4 squared is 16, and so on. And here is that colouring done for a few more numbers. And we can see that for numbers that are bigger than 1 and below -1, we've coloured them green because they lead to sequences which grow. Just remember the minus numbers, minus times minus is plus, so then it follows the sequence defined by the right hand side. But in this middle region between -1 and 1, the numbers get smaller. So if we started with a half or started with 0.8 or 0.1, the numbers would get smaller and smaller. So that's an interesting kind of map. There's something else we can do to this. Let's think about what divides these two regions, the red and the green, and we think then about the numbers 1 and -1. So 1 stays the same because putting 1 into the machine, 1 squared is 1, put that back, squared is 1, put that back, squared is 1, and -1 very quickly becomes 1, so -1 squared is 1, and then that squared is 1. So those two kind of stay the same in some sense. They don't get bigger and they don't get smaller. So that's almost like the dividing line, the border, the boundary between those two kinds of regions. So we can colour that in with a different colour. So this idea of making a map to show how different regions behave, that's important, and we'll carry that idea to drawing the Mandelbrot fractal. In fact, the Mandelbrot fractal is this kind of map. So the important idea there was this idea of iteration or feedback and maps of behaviour. So we're going to do that again now, and we're not going to use a different function, really. Well, slightly different, but that's not the important change. We're not going to use different colours. What we're going to change is the kind of number we're going to use. So we've been using normal numbers, 1, -1, 0.5, 2.4. These are normal numbers that we're used to. We're going to use a different kind of number called a complex number. And the terrible thing is, they're not complex. It's such a bad name because it scares people away. It's a real mistake in history, actually, to have called them complex numbers, because people who might be interested or would enjoy learning about them too many, even if it's a few, too many still get put off because they're called complex numbers, and that's terrible. If you're interested in the history of why they're called complex numbers, it's worth kind of digging that out and having a look. It's quite interesting. So the important point here is they're called complex numbers, but they're not complex. And what are these different kinds of numbers? Well, they're actually a group of two numbers. So this complex number, this composite number, maybe they should have been called composite numbers, they have two parts to them. And those two parts are just normal numbers. So this big yellow thing is a complex number. We've just drawn a circle for that. But inside are two normal numbers like 5 and 7. And that's it. And this idea of a thing made up of two parts shouldn't be alien. We are familiar with that. On the top left here, you can see a chessboard. And if you're familiar with chess, you'll know that the pieces, the squares, the locations, have names. Like E4 is a very common first move. E4 are two parts to describing that location, E and 4. In fact, when you look at sort of maps of the world or kind of maps designed for kind of hill climbing, you might see longitude and latitude. So a location has two parts, longitude and latitude. So again, it's another thing which has two parts. So it's nothing to be afraid of. We are used to the idea. If you work in an office or you work with kind of computers and spreadsheets, the cells have a two-part in describing their location. So this 30 here is at B3, B2. So B2, those are the two parts that define the location. In fact, we, throughout the tutorial videos, have been working with coordinates. So position is described by X and Y, how far along and how far up and down. So the location has two parts. And in fact, complex numbers, because they have two parts, very naturally can be thought of as coordinates on a surface. Great. And those two parts, we could have called them part 1 or part 2 or A and B, but historically they've gained the names real part and imaginary part. Again, don't read too much into whether that means they're difficult to work with. There's a ghostly imaginary part. There's just names that have been picked up through history. And in fact, again, the story behind how they came about is quite interesting. So do go and have a look. It's a little bit funny. So this complex number has two numbers inside it, and they're called the real part and the imaginary part. And that's just the naming. Nothing to worry about there. And there's an example of one. So 2 plus 3, 2 and 3 are the two parts, but the imaginary part is labelled with this little I here to tell us that it's the second part, so we don't confuse it with the first part. So I've coloured them here, but if we didn't have colours available, we would definitely need to rely on the I to say that's the imaginary part. So the real part is 2 and the imaginary part is 3. And you can see how, if we were going to draw this on a graph, we could say 2 across and 3 up. That would make perfect sense. So how do we work with these complex numbers? Well, you can do lots of things to them. We're going to just focus on adding and multiplying, and maybe subtraction. It's very similar to adding. And we're going to show that actually it's very familiar, the process of adding them. And if we think about kind of the normal kind of algebra that we might have done at school, it's the same thing that we're doing here. Let me draw a picture on a bit of a sketch here. So if I had 3x plus 2y, so this is normal algebra, and then I added to that 4x plus 1y. How do we add that? What we do is we bring together like terms. That's the word they used in school. It's essentially bringing together apples with apples and oranges with orange. So these are x's, 3x and 4x. So those are 3 x's, whatever x is, like 3 bananas, 3 cars, 3 pencils, 3 x's. And there's 4 x's here, so that makes 7x. And then we've got 2 y's, and again, y's could be grapes, olives, scissors, paper. But whatever they are, we can bring them together because that y is the same as that y. So we have 3 y's. So we're bringing together apples with apples and oranges with oranges. We're bringing together like terms, and the same thing applies to complex numbers. So when we add this complex number to this one, we bring together like for like, apples with apples, oranges with oranges. So here we bring together the real parts 2 and 1, and we bring together the imaginary parts 3 and 5. So that brings us 2 and 1 is 3, and 3i and 5i is 8i. Simple. I could have just said that, but I wanted to explain why that's the case. We're simply bringing together things of the same kind. Just another example here. We can add 2 plus 3i with 1 minus 5i, and that imaginary part here now is negative, but that's okay. So 2 plus 1 is 3, easy peasy. 3 adding minus 5 is minus 2, so we have 3 minus 2i. Again, that's what we would do with normal algebra. If we subtract two complex numbers, again it's the same. We bring together like terms, so 2 minus 1 is 1, and 3i minus 5i is minus 2i. Again, nothing surprising there. Let's think about multiplication now. And let me go back to the simple algebra that we would have done at school to guide us. So if I had 3x plus 2y and I wanted to multiply it by 1x plus 4y, what would we do? Well, we would bring together all the combinations of the terms. So we'd say 3x times x added to 3x times 4y added to 2y times x and 2y times 4y. All the combinations. We expand the brackets, as it were, and we can write that down as 3x times x is 3x squared, 3x times 4y is 12xy, and then we've got 2y times x is 2xy, and 2y times 4y is 8y squared. And then we can try and bring together things that are similar. So xy is here and xy is here, so that means it's 14xy. So we've got 3x squared plus 14xy plus 8y squared. Very familiar, if you've done any maths at school. So this idea, the important idea, is this combining all the different combinations, and that's what we're going to do here as well. So we've got 2 times 1 added to 2 times 5i added to 3i times 1 added to 3i times 5i, and let's see where that takes us. So 2 times 1 is easy, 2. 2 times 5i, well, 2 times is an easy concept for us. 2 times means just double it. 3 times is 3 of those things. So 2 of 5i should be 10i. That kind of makes sense. We've doubled its size in some sense. We've got 3i times 1, and we know that times 1 means leave it alone, keep it as it is, so that's easy. That remains as 3i. But we've got an interesting thing happening here. 3i times 5i. Well, we think that should be 15i squared. But what is I squared? That's interesting. What is I squared? Now, we could stop there and give up and go home. But actually what we've stumbled upon is just the one magic rule of working with complex numbers. So the important point I want to get across is working with complex numbers is just like doing normal algebra that we've just been sketching out, with the one additional rule about I squared. There we go, just saying, what is I squared? What is I squared? That's the question. So I could have told you what the answer is, what is I squared, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of intuition as to why it's the case. So this is a graph where we've got the real numbers across, and going up and down is the second part, the complex, the imaginary part. And we know we can put numbers on this grid like this one is 1 and 0i, and this one is 0 and 1i. If we were over here, say, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4 plus 1i, just using complex numbers as coordinates. Now if we have 1 here and multiply it by I, it moves around by 90 degrees anti-clockwise to become I. So I, acted on by a multiplication by I, becomes I. So it makes sense to think if we did it again, it would move around again by the same amount, and it would end up as -1. And in fact, that's it, I squared is -1. Now if you didn't understand that or didn't want to think too much about it, most people who work with complex numbers just know the rule I squared is -1, and that will take them as far as they ever need to go. You don't need to kind of explore any deeper than that. So complex numbers are just like normal numbers, normal algebra, as long as you remember this just one extra rule, I squared is -1, and that's an easy thing to remember. It's not a particular kind of heavy load. So let's apply that then. So we had 15i squared, and we can say I squared is -1, which turns it into a normal real number, the real part. It's not imaginary anymore. So we had 2 and then -15, so it's -13. So we've got our answer. Great. So now we know how to work with complex numbers in terms of adding them, subtracting them and multiplying them, and that's all we need. Now back to our magic formula x squared plus c, and we remember the process we were going through, iterating through it, starting a value, and we can say it starts at 0 plus 0i. We called x here, x is complex. So before we were using normal numbers, now we're saying x and c are complex numbers. So x will start it at 0 plus 0i, and we can pick a number for c and just keep it the same, keep it constant. It could be 2 plus 3i, it could be -5 plus 4i, as long as we stick with a choice and keep using that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use this process of feeding this machine, taking what pops out and putting it back in again. Now, when we had normal numbers, the map was going to be on a number line. With complex numbers, because they have two parts, they're two-dimensional, which means they're points on a grid, on a surface. What do we think the map would look like? The map that shows whether the numbers get bigger or smaller. So this green here, this is just my guess, this is not the right answer, this is my guess. If we choose C to be 2 plus 3i, and we start with x is 0, will the numbers, so 0 squared plus c, and then whatever the answer is, fed back in and then repeated, will it get bigger and bigger? And what about the numbers that are close to 0? will they get smaller and smaller? Well, that's kind of what we saw with the number line and normal numbers. So the intuition is that small complex numbers will get smaller and smaller, and big complex numbers will get bigger and bigger. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? That doesn't sound like we would be kind of wrong. But the question remains, what is the shape of the region in the middle? You know, what does the boundary between the two look like? My guess, it might be a circle or a square. That's kind of an initial guess. So let's look now at the actual process of iterating those numbers. So here we're trying c, the constant, as 2 plus 2i, easy choice. So we start with x as 0 plus 0i, so that's x0. We feed it through the machine and we get 2 plus 2i. Feed it to the machine again and we get 2 plus 10i. Feed it to the machine again and we get minus 94 plus 42i. Those numbers seem to be getting bigger, and if we drew them on a grid, they seem to be going away and running away from the center. In fact, they're rotating around as well. So that suggests to me that number escapes and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, that's easy enough to understand. Let's try a different choice of c. Actually, here's before we do that, here's another way of looking at what we've just done. So c is 2 plus 2i, and the first value is 0 for x, complex x. And what we're showing here is the real part and the imaginary part and the magnitude of those numbers in the sequence. So the first number that pops out is 2 plus 2i, and it has a magnitude of 2.828. What do I mean by magnitude? If I have a complex number that's, let's say, 2 plus 2i, so it's 2 across and 2 up, the magnitude is this distance from the origin, and we can work that out using, say, Pythagoras' theorem, which you'll remember from school. So it's this distance squared plus this distance squared and then square rooted. So 2 squared plus 2 squared square rooted, which is square root of 8, and that's the magnitude. The next number is 2 plus 10i, and it's got a bigger magnitude. The next number is minus 94 plus 42. That's got an even bigger magnitude. So you see the magnitude, the distance from the center, is growing quite rapidly. So we've just introduced this idea of a magnitude. And we can also plot the position of the numbers in that sequence, as well as the magnitude. And you can see here it kind of started close to 0, at 0, and then rotated around and then just escaped off the grid. The numbers just got too big. And we can see here that the magnitude gets big very quickly. If I look at the y-axis, the numbers are huge. This is another choice for C. Smaller numbers. So instead of 2 plus 2i, we've got 0.4 plus 0.4i. And here we're seeing an interesting thing where it's rotating around a little bit before it escapes. And we can see that in the magnitude it stays fairly small before it escapes. So that's interesting, that behaviour. We've not seen that before. We've seen where here we're seeing it lingering a little bit before deciding to escape. So that's unusual. Fascinating. Did not expect just this choice of complex numbers to show this kind of behaviour. Interesting. And here's another choice. Changed only by a little bit. So we've got minus 0.3 plus 4i, and we start at 0, and as we push the numbers through the machine, they seem to circle around some kind of attractor. This point here, they seem to circle around and fall towards it as if they're getting sucked in by a black hole. That's kind of magic, isn't it? Not seen that before, this kind of behavior where it doesn't escape totally. It seems to kind of fall into a magic point. Wow. And the magnitude kind of reflects that, where it oscillates up and down and then gets, very, very close to some magic value. That is interesting, isn't it? I think it is. Really unusual behavior. Did not expect that. And here's 0.3 plus 0.5i. Again, not so different from the other one. And the behavior again is different. It is orbiting, but it's now stuck in a wide orbit. It's not falling towards a magic point. It seems to be settling into the orbit itself. And you can see the magnitude kind of oscillating. That's interesting, isn't it? What else is interesting is that although we can see these going up and down in a fairly predictable way, the numbers are actually slightly different to each other. So if I said, what's the value at iteration number 50 or 400 or 1000, it's hard to tell. Although it looks like there's a pattern, we would actually have to work it out. There's no easy way of being able to quickly predict what future values are, and that's a symptom of what's called chaotic behavior. Chaos, mathematical chaos, and that's what we're seeing. Actually, we're seeing chaotic behavior, and the ingredients of chaotic behavior are two things. One is long-term unpredictability, so that if we want to know what happens after a long time, we actually have to work it out. There's no shortcut, there's no pattern that will predict it. And the second thing is that very similar starting points can diverge really quickly in how they behave. And we've seen that with, these points aren't too different from each other, and yet they behave very differently. So back to that question. Given that we've seen this rather unusual behavior, and if you remember, here was numbers that were, the real part of the imaginary part is bigger than 1, and we expect that to escape and explode. These 0.4 and 0.4 that didn't get to sucked towards 0, it didn't get smaller, they did explode as well. So our kind of guess that there was a boundary around 1 would separate the two kind of areas, the two kinds of behaviors, that doesn't seem right anymore. And we've got this unusual behavior as well. So what is this shape that's going to separate those numbers that get bigger and bigger and those numbers that get sucked towards 0? And what do we do about the ones that don't, that get sucked towards an orbit? I'm not sure it's a circle anymore. Maybe it's a square or a diamond or some kind of star. It's interesting, isn't it? What could this be? Well, let's have a look. So I ran a little computer program, I wrote some simple code. We'll write some code later as well, just to kind of pick a few points in a rough and ready kind of way and produce a map, picking about 30-40 points. And this is the answer. It's not a circle, it's not a square, it's not a diamond, it's not a star. It's that bug shape that we saw, the Mandelbrot set, the Mandelbrot fractal. So the Mandelbrot fractal, that thing we saw with all that beautiful intricate curls and patterns and design, that is it. That fractal is a map showing which regions of this complex number plane escape and get bigger and bigger, or don't, when we repeatedly put it through that machine. That's all it is. So it wasn't complicated at all, was it? Very simple ideas just applied to complex numbers, and we've just seen that they're not complex. Let's do this in more detail. So instead of 30, 40, 50 pixels, if I do that again with a much more fine grain and look at lots and lots of tiny pixels, so individual points that are closer together, and test them, it would look something more like this. And this actually is one of the earliest, if not the first, kind of visualization of the Mandelbrot set. I think it was done in the early 1970s, I think 1973, or was it 60s, around that time. You can look it up online, and it was done on what looks like is it a dot matrix or a daisy wheel printer? Yeah, certainly very early technology, and that was the kind of resolution they were working with, and that's a piece of history we're looking at here. There's a link there which you can which I'll share afterwards as well in the YouTube description, so you can have a look at that paper yourself. So that's history we're looking at. That was the very first kind of drawing rendition of this map, the Mandelbrot fractal, and they were shocked and surprised to see it. They thought it would be some kind of square or circle or something a little bit more regular, and yet we had this shape. And you can see there the complex numbers. They haven't used I, but that's, those are the early days then. So this is a quarter across, a quarter real part, 0 imaginary part, and this is -2 real, 0 imaginary part. They're doing theirs upside down here, so this is no, it's not, sorry, ignore that. So this is -0.07 for the real part and 0.96 for the imaginary part. So this is the slightly more detailed version of that, and you can see there's lots and lots of detail, isn't there? There's these kind of bulb kind of creatures, and each of those has smaller ones, and they all kind of give off filaments. Out at the front seems to be another version of the main thing. There's some up there as well, I think. There you go. That is the Mandelbrot set. A very simple rendition. Hopefully the explanation shows you that it's not a complicated thing at all. Yeah, so we could stop there and say, yep, that's it, job done. That's the explanation of the Mandelbrot set. But actually, let's take it a little bit further and think about, zooming in and maybe using colours as well. So here's a zoomed in section just to show that the detail remains. The more we zoom in, the more detail can be revealed. The detail doesn't end. Look at that, isn't that amazing? Those swirls. Wow. By the way, the coordinates of this thing, the coordinates I've chosen are the standard ones that everyone uses, and they go from -2.5 on the left, -2.25 on the left, up to 0.75 on the right, and then up and down is -1.5 and +1.5. Those are the coordinates for the zoomed in version, and these are the coordinates for a much more zoomed in version. So these are the coordinates of the bottom left and top right. So let's just kind of take a breath there and just repeat what that recipe was. We're picking a point C, a constant, and we're testing that point to see, does it explode or does it not? We repeat the application of that machine, x squared plus c, with x starting at 0. We keep doing it, and then we try to decide, does it explode? And if it does, it's outside the fractal. If it doesn't escape, it's inside. That's the recipe for the Mandelbrot set. Simple. That is it. So introducing colour. Again, there are lots of ways of doing it. You can invent your own. There's no wrong answers. The earliest and possibly still the most popular approach to kind of colouring focuses on the outside of the Mandelbrot set and looks at how fast those numbers escape. So if they grow slowly, we give them one colour. If they grow at a medium rate, we give them another colour. If they grow very quickly, we give them a different colour. And there is an easy way of kind of estimating that speed of growth, and we'll look at that very soon. So here's what that same fractal looks like if we do use colouring. So inside the fractal I've just used this reddish colour. Could have been black, could have been any other colour. For the outside regions, remember these escape, these get bigger and bigger. So dark blue are the numbers that get big very quickly, I guess greens get big a little slower, and the reds there would be taking their time to get bigger. And that shows us in more detail how those regions behave. We can see the contours of that land, as it were, the escaping land. And that's interesting, isn't it? It gives us more of an insight. And this is the same method applied to the same zooms that we did earlier. These fractals are related to the Mandelbrot. They're called Julia fractals. They're generated in a very, very similar way. We won't cover them today, but I did want to just show you them. They're more kind of self-contained in some sense. They're really beautiful. But once you've mastered the Mandelbrot fractal, making it, these things are a very trivial change. Great. So let's do some coding. Right, so I'm logged into Open Processing as usual. I've enabled my Simple.js library, and I've got my simple setup and an empty draw function. So what's the first thing to think about when we're drawing that fractal? Let's sketch some thoughts. So to keep things simple, I'm going to just use not an 800 by 600 grid, but a 600 by 600 grid, so a square grid. So I'm going to create a new canvas that's 600 by 600, and the coordinates here go from 0 to 600 and from 0 to 600 in this direction, but we need to kind of map those, as it were, to the scale of the Mandelbrot set. And we said that from here it was minus 2.25, and on the right it was 0.75. So the zero line would be somewhere along here, like that. 0, and then up here it was 1.5 and minus 1.5. Because it's symmetrical, it doesn't matter if we go minus 1.5 to 1.5. That doesn't go wrong, that's okay. So we need to somehow convert these coordinates into these ones, and we could do some multiplication and fractions and things to do that, but luckily the P5.js kind of language has a really nice function which we have used before called map, and it takes a variable from one range, so from say 0 to 600, to another range, say from minus 2.25 to 0.75. We've seen this before actually, and that will be really handy. It just makes things a bit easier. So let's code that. So I'm going to say, first we're visiting visit every pixel, if I can type. So we're going to use a for loop, and we'll say var x equals 0, x is less than say 600, and increase x by 1. In fact, while we're developing the code, we'll increase it by 5 just so we can get the results very quickly, and then we'll reduce that later. And that's the outer loop, and then we'll do that again for the inner loop, and we'll create a new variable y. So y goes from 0 to 600 as well, and we'll increase that by 5. I haven't set up my new canvas, so I'll do that at the top. Create canvas, and we'll say the size. So this is replacing the 800 by 600 canvas and creating a 600 by 600 canvas. Great. So just to test this loop is doing what we think it should, let's draw a point at xy, and that should give us just a grid of dots that are spaced 5 apart. Let's see if that works. Yep, tiny little dots there, placed kind of 5 apart. So we're visiting every point on that surface, and now we want to convert those coordinates xy into the complex number that we're going to test. So let's now convert xy to c, and c is complex, and not every language has the ability to work with complex numbers. Some do actually. It might be that JavaScript does, I can't remember, but I'm going to do it assuming it doesn't, because that skill is then transferable to other languages we don't. If it does, there'll be an even easier way of working, of coding, but let's assume it doesn't. So we'll say C is A plus BI, so we're going to work with A and B separately. So X will be converted to A and Y will be converted to B. So we'll say var A equals, we're mapping X from 0 to 600 to minus 2.25.75 to that range, and var B is almost the same, but we're mapping from minus 1.5 to 1.5. Great, so when X is 0, A is minus 2.25. When X is 600, A is 0.75. You can see how that works. Great, we've got that complex number now. We've got C is A plus BI. We know what the A and B is. Now we need to test that point. We need to repeatedly apply that machine x squared plus c. So we need to start with the starting value of x, which is, we shouldn't call it x, should we? We should call it z now. So rather than saying start with x equals 0 plus 0i, don't want to get confused with the x coordinate we're using up here, so let's call that z. Z is actually more common in the mathematics literature as well, so we'll use z as a convention now. So we'll have to think of a name for the real part and the imaginary part. Let's call it var z real equals 0 and var z imaginary, call it imag, equals 0. That's the starting value, and now we need a loop to repeatedly kind of grow those numbers or make them smaller. We'll see what happens to them. So we need some kind of loop. So we can say for var, we need to keep a count somehow. Let's call it iteration. Var iteration equals 0. We don't want to go on forever, so let's for now have a maximum number of iterations. So iteration is less than or equal to max iter. We'll have to invent that, so we'll say maximum iterations var max iter. Actually, let's put that underscore in. Iter equals, I don't know, 64. We can play with that later if that's not it's not sufficient. And then we'll say iteration plus equals 1. If you're not familiar with for loops, go back and look at some of the tutorial videos that we use to introduce loops and also for loops. Great, so in here we're going to do that that kind of applying that formula. So we'll say apply z squared, or z times z plus c. How do we do that? We need to do that algebra again. So we need to say z squared plus c. Now we need to implement that in our code, which doesn't work, or we assume doesn't work, with complex numbers. Now we know that c is a plus bi. We know that bit. And z, let's call that, think of 2 letters, m plus n. Actually, no, we've got them. We've got x and y, haven't we? X and y. We can use those for now, that's fine. We're just doing the algebra. X and yi squared plus c. So that's x and that's c. And we're squaring that. So we need to work out what the square is. If you remember school algebra, we know that a plus b squared is a squared plus b squared plus 2ab. You can expand out the brackets if you want with all the combinations. So you can do, let's do that just to be super clear. A plus b times a plus b. Letting the screen catch up. So we have that combination, a squared plus ab plus ba plus b squared. So we've got ab and ba, which is 2ab. That's where that comes from. So this thing will be x squared plus 2xyi plus y squared I squared, and then we've got a c, which is a plus bi. Now we know I squared is minus 1, do you remember that? So that becomes minus 1. So we've got x squared. Let's collect the real parts and the imaginary parts separately. So we've got x squared minus y squared, which is here. Let's cross them out. Got a plus a. Cross that out. So that's the real part. Now the imaginary part is 2xy plus b. Cross those out. And that's the imaginary part. This screen looks terribly complicated, but it's just really simple kind of school algebra. So this is the magic we're going to use. So z squared plus c, if we use xy for z and ab for c, that's the expression for z squared plus c. And we can code that, because we're back to using sort of normal numbers there. So we're saying the new updated z real equals z real times z real minus z imaginary times z imaginary plus c. Was that right? A squared minus a plus a. It's not c, is it? It's a. So the number that comes out of the machine is a complex number, and its real part will be this. That's what we've just worked out. And the imaginary part will be 2 times z real times z imaginary plus b. Let me just check I've got that right. Yep, that's right. That's the application now of the machine, and we're going to repeat that for a number of iterations. But actually there's an error here, and the error, not that one, the error is, I'll put brackets here just to kind of keep things clearer. In fact, I'll add some spaces because it's good practice to keep code readable. Just add those spaces in. There, much better. Now the problem that we may not have spotted is that in this second calculation here, we're saying 2 times z real times z imaginary plus b. Z real, we've just changed it on the previous line, so that would be the wrong value. We need to use this z real before it's been changed, otherwise it's not the valid version. So this one, we can fix this problem by saying that's a temporary one. Z real temp, so var z real temp, temporary one is that. And then after we've done the calculation and calculated z imaginary, we can then say z real equals z real temporary. So only after we've done all the calculation do we update the z real. That's a kind of one way around the problem. Great. So let's say we've done this iteration, say 64 times. How do we decide if the numbers have escaped or not? Let's go back to our pen and paper sketch to answer that question. So the question we're asking is whether a complex number is getting bigger and bigger and bigger or not. So we're going to be looking at the magnitudes, the distance from the centre, and we looked at those earlier. So the magnitude could go up. So if we kind of have iterations on the horizontal axis, it could go up and up and up, and that would be one way of saying, yep, that's definitely outside the fractal. They could go down, and that's one way of saying they are part of the fractal. They're on the interior, as it were. And there could be others that kind of linger around sort of specific points. Remember the strange attractors, and don't kind of go up. They seem to kind of head towards kind of a finite value. And there are those that kind of stay small and then take a long while to explode, and we saw that, didn't we, when we were trying some of the specific numbers. So does that mean we can't tell ever if a number is going to explode, if a starting point C is going to explode? Because if it hasn't exploded by iteration 20, it might at iteration 30 or 400 or 4000. Does that mean actually this idea of counting iterations and seeing how big the number is wrong? Well, mathematically, strictly speaking, it's kind of wrong. However, if we're being practical about it, what we can say is, if we say we've got 5 iterations, 5, because we can't let a program run forever, that's certainly impossible. So we have to decide how long we test each point for. So if we say we test each point for 5 iterations, if the number is big by then that's clearly escaped. If it hasn't, we can assume that it's not going to escape, that it's part of the fractal. Now, that we're not 100% safe in that assumption, but we are more safe if we say 10 iterations. We are more confident in saying that. And if we have 100 iterations, we'd be even more confident, because if the numbers haven't escaped by 100 iterations, the chance that they will is less. And if we need to, I guess we could have 1,000 iterations. But I guess what we're betting is that we'll have an approximately correct shape if we use a finite number of iterations. And it's a good experiment to try. So that's an important point in the logic of our code. Because unlike mathematics, which can talk about infinities and testing things for infinity, our actual code can't. So we've said 64 iterations. So what's the logic here? Well, we keep iterating for 64 iterations, or we stop. So we say we carry on as long as iterations hasn't reached 64, and the distance from 0 to from the origin to the current number is less than, I don't know, should we say 10? Is there a better number? Because if we could say 4, that means if the numbers have, so what we're saying is that if it reaches, say, 10, then we know it's escaped. That's the threshold. If we can say the threshold is 4, then we can quit that iteration loop quicker. We don't have to waste more iterations if we can say that 4 is a good enough value to decide that the number has escaped. Actually, the best answer is 2. And although we won't do it here, we can mathematically prove that if those complex numbers that pop out of the machine, if they reach a magnitude of 2, then they have escaped. They're not coming back. And we can mathematically prove that. If you're interested, I'll post a link to a blog that talks about it. But that's mathematically true. So actually we can say 2 there. So as long as the distance is less than 2, we can carry on around the iterations. Great. And then once we finish that loop, we will either have 64 iterations, or we will have less than that because we've decided it's escaped already. So let's test that. So if iteration is 64, actually it's going to be 64. I think it is. Yeah, it's iteration 64. I think it's going to be 65 actually when it comes out, because it's going to have the one added to it at the end. That might be 65. So max iter plus 1. I've never been a fan of the kind of JavaScript C style loops. They always make you think more than you should really need to. Right, so if it's reached the maximum number, then it's not escaped. So we can say, fill it with, say, black. So we can say stroke 0 for black, point x comma y. Let's see what that does. Oh, I've made a mistake somewhere. Let's go debugging. Pa-pum. Okay, I think I've spotted the mistake. It's 2 actually. I should have started iteration at 1. Again, these C Java style loops, I'm not the best fan of them, which is why some languages I think have a better approach to doing loops. And it's why I wrote the simple library to kind of introduce repetition function, which was easier to grasp than this for loop. Anyway, the real error that we've made is this here. It should have been y, not x. So let's fix that and see what happens. Great, there we go. You can faintly see the Mandelbrot shape there. We've done it. So the code isn't too complicated at all. There it is. Just a few lines of code. most of it's setting up variables. You know, that's all setting up variables. In fact, all of that is setting up variables. This is for, you know, visiting every pixel that we're interested in, and this is the repeated application of that machine, and this is just testing whether, you know, the numbers escaped or not, and then we color a point. So let's just increase those pixels, those loops by 1, so we do visit every pixel. So this will take a little longer to calculate. Oh, it wasn't too long, and that's the Mandelbrot set. Our simple code to create the Mandelbrot set. Fantastic, we've done it. It wasn't complicated at all. So we could definitely stop there and say, that's it, job done. We've understood the mathematics behind the Mandelbrot set, and we've written some very simple code. But actually, we're going to explore colouring, because that makes it much nicer. So here we've said, if the maximum iteration has been reached, then the numbers haven't escaped and they're inside. Otherwise, we're outside. And then we colour point x comma y. Then we have to colour a point that's outside the Mandelbrot set, and we could colour it red. I don't know, let's say 255, 255. Red is 0, isn't it? That would make the outside red. Let's have a look at that. It does take a few seconds to calculate. There you go. But we don't want it just red. We want it to show a sense of how fast those numbers got bigger. And all the information we've got is the iteration, the value of that variable. So if iteration was a low number, it means it escaped really quickly, got big really quickly. So if we say iteration, if the value is high, then it shows that the escape was slow. Let's see if that kind of colours the picture in an interesting way. Oh, that's rather dark, isn't it? Maybe if I multiply that by 64 times, it goes up 255, doesn't it? So 4, maybe 40. Let's just try that, see what happens. So we're making those numbers a bit bigger. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. That's really interesting. So you can see the contours now of the different regions. That's really interesting, isn't it? And we can then experiment with, maybe we'll have iteration times 30, or maybe we'll say 255 minus that. Just kind of combinations to pick a colour. See what that comes up with. Wow, look at that. That's interesting. I'm going to save a version of that. I like that. So you can experiment and try different colour schemes. What I suggest is that you don't just try different kind of expressions or different formulae for going from iteration to RGB. You could use HSB, but that's a good idea actually. Maybe I should have started with that. You might want to try interesting ideas like, if we say iteration %2, now percent, you remember, is called modulo. It means divide by 2 and take the remainder. So modulo 2 means, is the number even or odd? So this will be 0 or 1. And then if we say multiply that 0 or 1 times the iteration, that might give us some interesting pattern. It should give us a stripy pattern. Let's see what that does. I remember, oh, I needed to scale it back up, didn't I? Times 40. Let's try that. See what it gives us. Wow, look at that. So by taking the dividing by 2, taking the remainder, we've made it much starker and much clearer to see which of those regions within the kind of escape region is even or odd, and it reveals a really interesting kind of pattern, doesn't it? It really shows how that region is structured. That is interesting. One thing we can do is increase the maximum iterations. This will make the shape much more detailed or more accurate. Might take longer to calculate, but let's see the effect it has on the shape. It might make not much difference at all. If you do experiment more and you kind of zoom in a lot into small areas, you will need to increase the number of iterations to bring out and separate those points that are very close to either being in or out of the Mandelbrot kind of shape. Now this error message is worth kind of looking at. It's this open processing saying, oh, we've detected a long potential infinite loop, as in the loop was taking a long time to calculate. And as a beginner kind of coder, we sometimes do that accidentally. We have infinite loops, and it tries to protect us from that, but we know we don't want that protection. We definitely know these are long-running loops, so we'll add that no protect to the top of our code, just at the top there. It's a comment basically, but open processing will look for that comment and say, okay, so you don't want protection from kind of long-running loops that could be infinite. Let's take that back down to 64. Let's try dividing by 3. That means we should get not just even and odd, but sort of 3 levels of band. Let's see what effect that has. Wow, that's rather interesting. The colour scheme is a bit horrible, but we can work with that. Let's see what you can play and experiment yourselves. Yeah, I'm not really feeling that one. Another thing to try is something that is often seen only in advanced books and advanced kind of guides, and I don't know why. The other information that we can use to inform our colouring is not just the iteration that's left after that kind of loop, but the real and imaginary parts of of the final value. So we could say Z real and use that as part of our colouring scheme. Now that number might be big, might be small, I don't know. Let's try it, see what it looks like. It's not having much of an effect there. Maybe if I multiply it by a large number, it might be tiny. Oh wow! That is interesting, isn't it? So the colour has incorporated an element of the real part of the final number in the sequence, and you can see there's some really interesting structures emerging. So you can definitely have a play with that. You can try the imaginary as well, but I'm not going to do that now. What I'm going to do is colour the inside. So we left that as black, but if we say Z imaginary times 400 and say Z real times 400, so we're now colouring in the inside of the fractal using the image. So the outside will only depend on iteration, the inside will depend on the value, those imaginary real parts. Now I don't know what this is going to look like. Let's see. Oh wow, look at that. That is interesting. It's got kind of a gradient on the inside, and those bulbs seem to Wow, look at that. Oh, that's fascinating, I think. I'll make that back to 0 again, just to see what what imaginary part does, just to see the effect of that. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Wow. I think that's pretty cool. So yeah, we'll stop there. I do sometimes get tempted to carry on experimenting. So we've achieved our mission. We've seen, number one, the mathematics behind the fractal, one of the most famous fractals, one of the most famous mathematical objects, one of the most fascinating. And we've seen that actually the process is not difficult at all. We're just seeing which numbers get bigger and which don't, and we're making a map, and we just happen to be using complex numbers which shouldn't be called complex at all, and we've seen that we can work with them by adding them and multiplying them. And we've written some simple code, and I'll share that code so you can have a look yourselves. Job done. Fantastic. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that's demystified what is sometimes a mysterious kind of knowledge about how to create these things. See you next time.